Thank you for standing by. At this time, all phone lines are in a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, you may press star 1 and record your name and affiliation to ask a question. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the meeting over to your host, Rachel Kraft.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Kraft, Public Affairs Officer at NASA headquarters in Washington. I'd like to welcome you to today's media availability to discuss the agency's Space Act agreement with Bigelow Aerospace for its insight on collaborating with commercial industry on exploration beyond Earth's orbit. As for the order today, we have two speakers joining us. Each will give brief remarks, and then we'll take questions. Today's speakers are William Gerstenmaier, NASA's Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations, and Robert Bigelow, Founder and President of Bigelow Aerospace. Bill, if you'd like to start us off.
Thanks, Rachel. Again, it's my privilege to be here to get a chance to talk to you. We signed the Space Act back at the end of March, and the purpose of the Space Act simply was for us in NASA. We typically do a lot of design reference mission analysis. We do a lot of concept work. We do a lot of things, and then we typically ask industry how they can participate or be part of that activity. And we thought that this time, instead of doing it the typical way, we would kind of turn that around a little bit. We would ask industry first through the Space Act agreement what they're interested in, what they see interest in doing exploration throughout the solar system, where they see human presence that makes sense, where they see potential commercial markets. And they would give us some answers to that through the Space Act through essentially two gates. There's a Gate 1 and a Gate 2 in the Space Act. We'd get that information back in-house, and we'd take a look at that, see how it compares with our programs, look for natural synergies, look for places where we no longer need to develop capability, and we can use the commercial market for those activities and go out for services. So this is our attempt to kind of look at this a different way, and instead of being the typical approach where we put together all the plans and we ask for participation, we wanted to look at it the other way and see what's available, and this Space Act activity is the way for us to do that. And these gates run about 100 days and 120 days for the two gates. So this activity is fairly short, but pretty intense activity, and we're looking very forward to getting the information and reports. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, Will. We signed this agreement on the 27th of March, so we've just passed the 60-day marker. And, Bill, I would like to hand you the draft of the copy of the report. So we're about 40 days ahead of schedule. So we had a lot of excitement and interest from various companies in gathering information on that report. I thought it might be helpful for some of you in the audience that have not seen the Space Act agreement to listen maybe to what the purpose is actually embodied here in this document. And if you want to hear for yourselves what the intent of the parties is, there's nothing better than to know the communication directly from the document itself. So it says the purpose of this agreement, and by the way, this is a holistic kind of effort. This is an organic effort. It is intended to encompass as much as possible informationally, and it's intended to evolve and to grow. So reading from the document itself here, it says the purpose of this agreement is to facilitate and explore in a manner that meets both national and commercial goals and objectives, joint public-private arrangements that would continue to build the ability for humans to live and work in space through the expansion of exploration capabilities beyond low Earth orbit. The partnership continues to foster increased commercial use and research in low Earth orbit on the ISS, and with Bigelow Aerospace private sector near-term plans to design, develop, and operate in low Earth orbit a commercial space station capability. In addition, it is coupled with private sector long-term plans of beyond low Earth orbit operations, including those of Bigelow Aerospace, to place a lunar base on the surface of the moon. This joint involvement between human space exploration and commercial enabling utilization can provide a synergy and enable missions in concert with national capabilities and technology investments such as NASA's Orion and Space Launch System capabilities. And I could go on, there's more there, but I think that gives you the gist and the understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with this Space Act agreement.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll now take questions. We'll first take questions from here in the room. And for those of you here who would like to ask a question, if you could go up to one of the mics, that way the folks dialed in via the phone will be able to hear. And then for those on the phone who'd like to ask a question, when we get to those, just a reminder that you can press the *1 keys on your telephone to signal the operator. And we'll begin here. Go ahead.
Marcia Smith with SpacePolicyOnline.com. I'm curious as to how you went about doing the study. Did you make a survey of other companies interested in public-private partnerships, or how did you actually approach this?
We did a combination of things. When we were anticipating the execution of this agreement, we started to work right away. So we didn't waste time until the actual ink was dry on the document. So we jumped on this about a month ahead of time, and we began to talk to a variety of companies that are listed in the report that I have here, and in the copy, yes. And so we list some of those companies here, and we got input from a variety of folks as to their ideas, their thoughts, their ability to execute the fabrication of certain kinds of space hardware, what the collateral costs might be of those types of space hardware, and the kind of schedule. But we did this from the context of making it clear to them that this was not a normal NASA effort. This was one where they had to look at Bigelow Aerospace as the contractor, general contractor, and they were going to treat this in an entirely different cost metric than what they normally might have treated it, how they might deal with it. Because we're very demanding on being cost effective, very demanding on schedules, and yet we're open-minded in giving opportunities for companies to give us options and alternatives. So that was a big part of the process.
Hey there, Mark Matthews with the Orlando Sentinel. I'm just very curious about what was in the draft booklet that you just gave Gerst. Can you give me some of the big takeaways? What can we look forward to here?
Well, I don't know. I've just received it right here, right? So yeah.
The draft is only missing one section, which has to do with space medicine, which is obviously a very important topic, and the further away from Earth that you get, the more important that topic becomes. So we get into everything to do with low Earth orbit operations from a commercial standpoint of what can you do microgravity research-wise, what's the past history of the positive results in that area, experiments flown on station, on the shuttle, and so forth, and how can the commercial sector expand on what's already been done and derive out of that benefits for NASA. Yeah. So
what would you consider the most feasible astronaut-related mission in that booklet that could happen in the next 10 years, if any, in the next 10 years?
Well, the easiest mission is, and the least expensive for NASA by far, is to have essentially this configuration in low Earth orbit. That's 660 cubic meters of volume, which is over half of what the ISS has. And in that configuration, that is a very affordable configuration for NASA. So that is very easy to do. From addressing what we can do beyond that, we got into scenarios with L2 and cislunar orbit.
Can you say anything more about L2 or perhaps even lunar missions that might be possible here?
We addressed in Gate 1, this assignment was broken into two phases, Gate 1 and Gate 2. Gate 2's assignment has not begun yet. So in concluding Gate 1, what we addressed were the assets, the menu, so to speak, of assets for everyone to consider. Who was going to be producing those assets? When we could produce those assets? And the practicality in were these assets already in development, which it turns out most of them are. Most every asset that we considered is already in some form of development.
Yeah, hi, Dan Leone with Space News. I have two questions, I guess one for each of you. The first is a Bill question, and so this report that's just been handed to you, I'm still not quite clear about what Bigelow's provided. Is it a list of design reference missions? Is it a catalog of hardware that could be built? Is it a list of requirements or opportunities for Bigelow and private operators at large to contribute to human exploration? I'm not sure exactly what's just been delivered. And then second, you might not be able to see it so well on the television, but there's a lot of interesting new models here of hardware. The one right behind Mr. Bigelow, the little propulsion tug there. Can you talk a little bit about those? When were those concepts thought up, and who do you envision helping you work on those?
Well, first of all, in the report, I haven't read it in detail since I just got it, but we'll go looking through it. What we were looking for kind of in Gate 1 is just some general areas of where we see, or where the private sector sees interest in space and human space exploration. And so some of the areas that Bob talked about, the pharmacological items, some plant growth things, some of those other things are described in here that are of interest. There's some concepts of how they would be put together, and then NASA will take that information, look at it, and it helps us think about as we want to go do a private-public partnership, or we want to go do some mission or some activity. This can be a reference for us to take a look at and say, hey, there's already some interest in this area. How can we synergistically work with the private sector to achieve what our goals are, and how can we use what they're already doing kind of on their own, or where they see a market out there? So that's how we kind of intend to use this information, to take this and use it to inform our planning and our thought process as we go forward.
Yeah, the theme of this was to acquire as much information as possible from what the private sector is already doing, and in the context of if they are already investing their own capital and efforts into certain areas of hardware and missions, isn't there an opportunity in there for NASA to benefit, so that NASA isn't having to pay the perpetual heavy burden of research and development costs, for example? In our case, with the BA-330, there is no investment by NASA in that architecture, in that spacecraft. And that goes for other iterations of other hardware. The future next generation of the 330 is the Olympus. And there will be no R&D costs if NASA uses that spacecraft either. Also, with the tugs that you just referenced, we have a family of transit tugs, each with a slightly different mission, and there are 4 different versions of those tugs. There will be no R&D expense associated with those as far as NASA is concerned if they chose to use them. And so that's all part of the benefit package that is incorporated in this document.
Hi there, Nick Taborek with Bloomberg News. So in this report, are you recommending NASA change its stance on the moon, on its stance on going to the moon or on the asteroid mission?
The brass ring for us is having a lunar base. That as a company, that's what we're in conjunction with other companies, and even other possibly foreign entities as well. So that is an appetite and a desire that we've had for a long, long time. This is not exactly connected to this report in any specific kind of context. The word lunar moon base or moon was referred to, but again, the effort in this Space Act agreement is to gather as much information that NASA can potentially use as possible. And that was the spirit of the document.
Okay, so having the moon activity, the lunar base mentioned, what was the significance of that in the work you were doing here?
I think this is a holistic effort. This is an effort that tries not to have boundaries. And so NASA is saying, look, give us a full menu, if you can, of what we might be able to utilize. And then we'll decide for ourselves at some point what kind of hardware we can incorporate into what kind of missions, and we'll look at those costs, and we'll look at those schedules and see if it makes sense to us.
And I'd say from a NASA perspective, it's important for us to know that at least this document refers that there's some interest in the moon activity and the lunar surface activity. So then that says if we as a government choose not to pursue that, that's fine. We can still go into lunar orbit. We can look at activities there. We talk about this asteroid retrieval mission where we bring an asteroid back into lunar orbit. We're going to have the capability to get into lunar orbit, which then can be synergistic with what maybe the commercial sector wants to do in terms of lunar surface activities. So therefore, we're kind of getting, as Bob said, a holistic look at this entire scenario of exploration, what the private sector is potentially interested in, what we're interested in as a government, and then we look to build plans that take advantages of the best of what the private sector's doing and what we're pushing in terms of the government side as well, too. So this gives us a chance to kind of step back and do a more unified or a bigger view of our planning and not doing it in our own little stovepipes. We're actually reaching out and starting to look right at the beginning as we start to formulate our thinking.
We have a few questions on the phone. Let's go to those, and then we'll come back around to the room. So let's go to the operator for a few of those telephone questions.
Thank you. Mark Carreau from Aviation Week and Space Technology. You may ask your question.
Thank you. As I read the agreement and listened to you, I almost get the sense that the Gate 1 draft is a sort of catalog of capabilities, and if that's somewhat closely descriptive, I think this is for Mr. Bigelow. I wonder if you could sort of describe, who you got. You may not name each company, but you might sort of give us a flavor for the different kinds of expertise that are reflected in the document draft.
We talked to a number of companies that are well known, including SpaceX and Boeing and Sierra Nevada, Orbitech Technologies Corporation for the hydroponics section. So the menu there is familiar relative to the names of those companies. That you would recognize most of the names. There are about 18 or 20 that are listed in the back portion of this report.
Can you talk about what kind? I mean, aerospace, and then you mentioned pharmaceutical and I think agriculture in a broad sense. But are there any other sorts of areas that kind of reflect how deep, how wide the private sector interest is? And I presume you're just U.S. companies.
No, not just U.S. companies. We've had conversation with representatives from foreign space agencies. They're very interested in having opportunities and venues for flying more often. They would like to fly at least every year, if not more than that. And so we perceive a market there from a lot of countries that do not get those kinds of opportunities to fly. And in the spirit of this document, commercialization is significantly referenced. If it can be done without co-opting the necessities of what NASA wants to do on board, and if we could timeshare those facilities and by mutual agreement reach the kind of accommodations that would work in everybody's behalf, that's the objective.
Our next question comes from Keith Cowing from NASA Watch.
I have a two-part question. First of all, will this report be released to the public in a time manner that makes it relevant, not months or years from now when it's probably passé? And second of all, I just read through the Space Act agreement again, and as Mark Carreau, I think, hit it right on the head, it's sort of like a shopping list, a catalog, sort of a status report, who's doing what and when and so forth for both the private sector and NASA. The question I have is more to the application of these things and testing them out. You're going to be flying something up to station soon. That'll give you some good data there. But this thing that Gerst mentioned a moment ago about lunar surface work, the question I guess I want to ask you comes from personally having lived in the Arctic for a couple months and other weird places in analogs and so forth. We lived in tents and domes and things like that. Is there any interest beyond the SpaceX agreement where, for example, Bigelow and NASA and other parties might take Earth versions of these inflatables, set up a base in an actual remote, far away, hard to get to place, so as to get data on how these things actually work in the field? Even though you're on Earth, these analogs oftentimes, having been there, you can get pretty isolated and have to be pretty creative. Are you looking beyond this agreement to actually, not cutting some metal, but inflating some domes or modules on Earth and then trying to reduce a little bit of the risk there? or is this something that NASA needs to pay for?
Bob can take the second question. I'll take the first one. We'll release a report as soon as we get kind of the final version, so it'll be a couple of weeks to get this one section added, a little bit of us looking at how we want to distribute it, but it'll get released as soon as we've got it in the, kind of the final format, and then we'll continue through Gate 2, and at the end of Gate 2, we'll release the second gate, and then Bob can answer the second question.
Yeah, we're also to the architecture of the expandable systems. They're not. The purpose is not to satisfy a need that is in a 1G environment. So what they can tolerate is extreme environments of variety of thermal impacts, debris impacts, and sustain very well long duration missions in a microgravity environment or in a deep space environment. They also can be very comfortable resting on a somewhat irregular hard surface. The shields are very thick, and so the materials are very strong. So 1/6 gravity, for example, that you would have on a lunar surface is not probably an issue. Even perhaps a 38% gravity on Mars. In order to provide decks inside, the easiest way for us to do that is to attach a form of webbing or netting using Velcro anchors on the scuff coat of the interior of the spacecraft, and so we can adjust flooring and that sort of thing to translate fore and aft in the spacecraft. That would not be practical in a 1G environment. We are going to have a flight-like testing unit called the Guide, which is a scale lunar base that will be, we're trying to get that in contract so the work will be concluded and we can demonstrate this spacecraft in the first part of 2014. And the idea is that we're essentially deploying a structure that has arrived in lunar orbit as a station, and then it has loader capability and descending capability, and it lands as an all-up base with transit tugs attached to the axis of the 330. That is the simplest, least expensive base that we can construct. We have other iterations involving more 330s and more habitats, but we are very serious about this, and so we are going to do a flight-like demonstrator of that technology.
Okay, well, if I follow up, when you say flight-like, are you talking about doing this on Earth, or are you actually talking about launching this?
It's going to be the size that's less than an automobile, but it will be demonstrated here on Earth, probably in 2 or 3 different venues, and we'll use probably one of the dry lakes around the outside of Las Vegas to do our first demonstrations before we're ready for a prime time demonstration.
And would prime time be orbital, or are you actually going to try and toss this to the moon?
No, we will continue to do an extensive series of tests here on Earth and migrate up to maybe a full-scale system where we have to allow for the 1G difference, and we want to provide as much validation. We're not huge fans of resting on just computer modeling. We like to get into the integrity and the veracity of hardware that actually has been put through its paces if we're able to do that.
Well, that was the gist of my question. Having done this myself, you don't want to do your homework when you're setting the thing up. You want to have thought it out, but nothing is like actually doing it. I guess if I could sneak one last question in there, is there a dotted line beyond which your investment, you sort of say, if there's no market for this, I'm just not going to go there? Or are you sort of looking at these agreements as each time NASA sort of puts another foot in, are you encouraged to, ratchet things up a bit? Or do you just sort of have a line in your head of saying, well, you know what, I'm only going to put so much in. If NASA doesn't step up to the plate, nice try, guys, I'm going to go off in another direction.
Well, there's nothing that's risk-free. And as I recall, the initial Apollo flights in 1969, in July of 1969, about July 20th or so, I believe that was an all-up launch rocket. I don't believe that was too incrementally experimented with. the risks were enormous in so many different directions. So the Saturn V was a really gutsy move, along with the immature level of computerization and everything else that Neil and Buzz had to work with. So that was an enormous order of magnitude more risk compared to what we know today and what we can prepare for. I think that we've always been connected to transportation as the critical element in which we as a company are connected where we're going to fail, and ditto for the nation as a whole. We can't intend to rely on Russia forever for our transportation. So that problem has to be solved, and I think at $70 million a seat, there ought to be some urgency to that. So as a company, we're just as much focused on transportation, and it is the singular most important element that we have as a company to worry about.
We have another question here in the room, so we'll go to that question and then back to the operator for other questions.
Thank you. Dick Farley with Cape Cod today. We're talking mostly about hardware so far and industrialization. I'd like to see if maybe Bill or Bob, whichever, could address the question of space industrial policy. Is there a provision in this contract or in your considerations for considering international policy issues, who's thinking about protecting or management of the implementation, coordinating safety, occupational issues, and public safety, as well as indemnification? I'm thinking analogous to the way the nuclear energy industry got started with certain indemnifications and kind of a subsidies of that type of investment early on. Where in this consideration do regulatory and public policy issues fit into the process?
I can address a little bit. I think in this first report you won't see much of that addressed, but in the second phase we need to start talking and thinking about that, because that's going to be clearly a driver, and Bob can talk about it probably better from the private sector standpoint than I can. But it's clear that if we don't understand indemnification, we don't understand intellectual property rights, we don't understand other aspects of this from a kind of a basic legal framework standpoint, that can be a stumbling block to what investment companies are willing to make. So again, I would look for some thought from the private sector about what do they consider as the major kind of legal framework things that need to be resolved that could be an inhibitor to us continuing private-public partnerships. So we're looking for some of that information in these series, in these two gates, that will help inform us about what we ought to be doing here to try to enable this market or this sector to continue to grow. And there's clearly things that I think will help and enable that, and there's clearly things that will hinder it. And then there's other areas by us being silent, it just slows it down. So I think if we can get some insight from the private sector of where they see those, then maybe we could start, from a government standpoint, start working down some of those restrictions and constraints.
Right. As with the aircraft industry, we're anxious to see the FAA become very involved in the certification process and the transportation especially, and we're very comfortable with that. We are cognizant of all kinds of liability issues, and even though we would have informed consent agreements, we still would want to have some protection with a limit as to the kinds of lawsuit implications and kind of impacts that could suffocate a nascent industry before it ever got a chance to really get going. So it's a complex process involving federal agency like the FAA, involving the government as a whole in providing some kind of insulary type of insurance as currently exists for the aerospace industry, and we're just advocating continuing that. We are more sensitive than people realize about safety, because in a corporate context, you're as good as your reputation, and you don't have the kind of wherewithal to sustain fatalities like a government can sustain. So we have a much lower threshold of tolerance and ability to acclimate ourselves to a very bad day. That's the last thing we ever want to see.
Hi, Dan Leone with Space News again. Just quick question about some dates here. Now, as you mentioned, Mr. Bigelow, there's a transportation hitch in the model of bringing people to habitable structures in low Earth orbit. But for the time being, SpaceX has published its dollars per mass, and it seems like there's an opportunity to launch a space demonstration whenever you might be ready to do it. So you talked a little bit about some of the ground testing you plan to put the test module for the lunar base. When would you envision launching a space-based test, and would you just launch it to space immediately after you finish everything that's going on the ground, just like that? When's the soonest you think you could get it to orbit?
Our strategy and plan is as follows. We will have 2 of these 330s ready to launch by the end of 2016. The first one would launch, obviously, unoccupied. And as we learned through our previous launches in 06 and 07, we can investigate easily the integrity, the health of the spacecraft from the ground without anybody being on board. So we know through a variety of means of interrogating the spacecraft. Once we're satisfied that the environment and essentials on that spacecraft are functioning as they should function, then that's when we launch a taxi launch with a crew of 2 people, and then the capsule would be loaded with supplies. So when they dock to that first spacecraft, they start setting up house, so to speak. There are a lot of things to deploy and to make ready for the next docking, which would be the second 330. That's after years and years of testing every kind of thing you can possibly imagine through long-duration tests, thermal tests, moment tests, everything you can think of, we've already done. So terrestrially, we can get to a significant level of confidence, maybe 90% confidence terrestrially without flying. The 2 Genesis missions helped us gain through flight further knowledge and experience, and the last 10% is actually only really acquired through the actual execution of the flight. But we would not be having anybody on board until we're satisfied that spacecraft is ready.
Okay, let's go to the phone for a few.
Thank you. Ives Groden from NASASpaceflight.com. Your line is open.
Yeah, hi. My question is for Bill. Once the ISS is deorbited, it's not clear if NASA will abandon LEO or not. And I mean, I guess one of the possibilities is to rent a Bigelow module after 2020 or 2028, whenever it is that the ISS is deorbited. Is that part of this agreement, looking at what can be done once the ISS is deorbited? And I have a second question. My second question is, Administrator Bolden recently said that the moon was off the table, and this agreement kind of says that it might still be on the table. So I'm just wondering, which one is it? Is the moon still on the table or not?
Okay. First of all, to your first question, the way we kind of envision space station is it's a tremendous proving ground for us now. In other words, we're working through the Center for Advancement of Science in Space, the CASIS organization, to reach out to pharmaceutical companies, to reach out to other materials companies, to look at using unique properties of microgravity, and also look at using the unique environment, the observational environment of space station, where you can look down on the Earth, look at carbon generation. You can look to deep space. You can look for high-energy particle physics. Station is a platform where people can experiment to see what makes sense to them, where's a market, where's a unique aspect that gives a company a competitive advantage over a company that's only doing terrestrial research. So once Station proves that there's kind of a market, then we envision that market then moving more to the private sector, and we see that getting picked up in low Earth orbit. Exactly who provides that, I think it's someone other than the government, but some company would essentially provide that service, and it creates essentially a new economy based on space research and microgravity research and the uniqueness of space. So that's kind of the vision of where we are. We think station can fly till 2028, but there's a finite amount of time on station in terms of lifetime, so we have a fairly short window to prove that this is here to the benefit of the commercial and terrestrial companies, that they can do this research, and then we need to hand that off to the next sector. So that's one piece. The other thing I would say also is we have a very strong shared interest in commercial crew activities. We clearly need to get commercial transportation to and from low Earth orbit. We need that for space station, as Bob talked about. He needs that for his modules. So that funding that we've got in the commercial crew program that we're working now in this real budget environment is critically important to us to get that capability online as soon as we can. So I think in general our approach is like I described moving forward. As far as the moon being off the plate, I think from a government standpoint, right now we have more interest in maybe the asteroid kind of missions. The Mars is our ultimate horizon. But what's interesting in this report is, at least this report implies that the private sector is very interested in lunar activity, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. NASA and the government, we focus on maybe deep space, we focus on asteroids, the private sector picks up the lunar activity, and then we'll combine and share with them to see what makes sense. Transportation to the same region is common between us. Other aspects, life support, are common between us. We can do lots of co-development between these that actually share what the private sector needs and what the government needs. We do that development where it makes sense to share. If there's something unique for the lunar environment, they would pick that up on their side. If there's something unique on the government side for beyond low Earth orbit, beyond lunar activities, pressing on towards Mars or an asteroid, then the government picks that up. So I think what we're trying to look here is not focus silos and pieces, but look at this as a holistic activity of where there's a public-private partnership moving forward, and we're going to do this not just as an individual nation. We're going to do it both internationally, and we're going to do it with private-public partnership as we move out and push humans out into the solar system.
Okay, just one clarification. When you say, like, for example, after the ISS is deorbited and might be passed on to the commercial sector, do you mean that NASA would not be involved at all, or would it pay, like, for example, rent for a station?
I think, again, it depends what clearly on station today we're doing some research that really is more geared towards just NASA. We're doing some things where when astronauts go distance as far as Mars, they'll be exposed to microgravity environment for maybe a 1 year transit one way, a year transit back. So we're going to have to understand how the human body actually can be kept healthy during that long period, so that's of NASA's interest. We would still want to do that research. Low Earth orbit is a very good environment to do that. We would acquire that capability from the private sector for those individual needs. So I think NASA will still have some research interests in low Earth orbit. We may want a new sensor to look at weather or look at winds on the Earth, a new weather sensor. This platform might be a good place to check out that sensor, just like the space station is. So we'll look and see what our NASA needs are, but we won't be in the business of actually maintaining and operating the facility in low Earth orbit. We believe that's now a service that would be available from us in the private sector to go do that. I would also say I think it's also wrong to think about the station ends and then the new product begins. I think there needs to be an overlap between those two, where there's a phase-in period where station is flying, still doing some basic government kind of things. At the same time, the private sector is picking up, and then we flow naturally and seamlessly into that. But I think if we take that approach where we end one and then begin the next one, we typically could have a break in the activity, which I don't think we want to have.
Irene Klotz from Reuters, you may ask your question.
Thanks very much. I have 3 questions. The first 2 for Mr. Bigelow. The first is, in the first part of this study, did you also survey launchers, launch capabilities?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
So did you find anything that, besides perhaps the Falcon Heavy, that would possibly be a similar capabilities as the SLS?
Yes, I think I should be conservative on my specific comment about that, because the company may not appreciate my advancing any kind of news that they would prefer to advance themselves. But we're comfortable with the prospects of having 2 functioning super heavies. Well, at least we call the Falcon Heavy is super heavy because it exceeds by such a large margin the Delta IV capability. So we're encouraged by the reaction to SpaceX to address their architecture, their lifting capabilities, and into other generations besides just the heavy generation. So they are in it for the long haul. They're not in it for any kind of a temporary situation, I assure you. And then, of course, you have the SLS, which has a advertised 70 metric ton capability. We've been told privately it might even be more than that. So we're glad to see those two potential lifting vehicles.
Okay. The other question for you is, I understand in the course of doing this work, you're acting more like a general contractor and not a private company interested in lunar development and other space initiatives. But could you maybe give us a little sense of, or I guess an opportunity to sort of remove any bias by describing what, if your company was doing this and did not have a lunar base plan or the inflatables planned in low Earth orbit, is there any sort of momentum or any sort of reason for even looking at commercial initiatives in deep space exploration?
As a general contractor, we are used to behaving in a way where we solicit multiple proposals and bids on the same scope of work from multiple companies. So that is routine. We're also used to and handle in a routine manner the fact that any proposals that we get are couched in a fixed price context. We are also very determined to make the subcontractors acutely aware that we are very schedule conscious. That is standard behavior for us. If it weren't that if we did not have the interest and the investment in expandable systems, then the only other avenue for us to be involved in space activity would probably be through the means of being an investor. So we are in this because we need to have the transportation because it's self-serving for our agenda, and we don't have any parameters on the extent of where we want to go, frankly. We look at the moon as a very, very important learning ground that's close to home, where if things go wrong, you want to be in your own backyard and not 40, 50 million or 100 million miles away. So we look at that as an absolute necessity from a private sector standpoint. That's our own philosophy.
I know we have a few more questions, so for those dialing in, if we can limit to one question each, we'll try to get to all of them before we need to wrap up.
Our next question comes from James Dean from Florida Today.
Well, thank you. Mr. Gerstenmaier, you're in close contact with industry every day. I'm just wondering if you could explain further why Bigelow Aerospace is so key to giving you this commercial outlook and helping to enable it.
Yeah, again, I think it's the difference between being a government entity and a private company. Even though we're in pretty close contact with them, they're used to a relationship between themselves and the government, and I think that biases some of the discussions, biases some of the information that we receive and the data we get. So we reached out to look at someone that we thought that could speak the language of the private commercial sector in a more open way, communicate with them in ways they can understand a little bit differently, and not get the bias that it would be what our typical large government contracts are, with cost-plus kind of contracts, a different way of doing business where these things that Bob talks about are important, where schedule is really key, delivering on price, those kind of things are important. But to have that come from the private sector almost to the private sector, to me, is a different way of getting the information that I think it removes some bias and some filter if we try to go do this study on our own.
Mike Wall from Space.com. You may ask your question.
Hi. Thank you guys for doing this. This question's for Bob, I guess. You mentioned that there was a lot of commercial interest on the surface activities on the moon, I guess. Could you just go into a little detail about what some of those main avenues were? What are some of the things that these companies said about what they would hope to do on the moon or plan to do on the moon?
Most of the conversation was focused on more immediate means of acquiring a commercial benefit, and that means closer to home. It means low Earth orbit. It means L2 or cislunar orbit. Taking somebody to the general vicinity of the moon without actually landing them is still a big deal. There is a potential revenue stream, obviously, in that if people are willing to pay to go to LEO. There are folks who are also very interested in going to L2 and other locations without actually getting to the surface. So most of the conversations we had were not in the context of we're going to go out there and extract helium-3 and we're going to process that and create a fusion reactor that everybody's been waiting for. Most of that is a to be determined thing that even though we frankly have a time schedule for that, it's in our own personal case, we have a time frame for trying to execute a landing of a lunar base, but that wasn't the purpose of this Space Act agreement per se. It was to look at kind of what is the low-hanging fruit here in terms of more immediacy, and if the transportation is going to be available in 2017, then what does that intersection do? But it, not just for Bigelow Aerospace, but for NASA and for other kinds of companies that want to expand the possibilities in a different kind of cost regime. And so that's the kind of, we're looking at, basically 4 years away, and that's for starters. If we're out to 2024, for example, that's a little more nebulous, and a lot of folks don't want to make investments or necessarily plan for that kind of a target that far away in a very serious kind of expenditure. But all the assets that we're talking about here are all the kinds of assets that you need to go to L2, to go to cislunar orbit, or to execute missions to the surface of the moon or even onto Mars. So there's nothing wasted here at all in terms of its either-or situation. That's not the case.
Our next question comes from Keith Cohen of NASAWatch.com.
This is a question for Bill Gerstenmaier, and if I could take you back to when you and I were grunts sitting at design reviews in Space Station Freedom. And the way we used to do things at NASA is you had to have 2 strings of redundancy, and you couldn't say, if it breaks, I'll fix it. And there's a lot of stuff you just couldn't do. And as we were doing these reviews, the station we had wanted wasn't the one we got. So the complexity was gone, the flexibility was, we got something far less capable than we had hoped. At the same time, we were told we had to go work with the Russians. And you go look at what they were trying to do with Mir. I mean, they were using like metal snips and hammers to fix things there. They seemed to think that was a completely meritorious way to run spacecraft. And I remember trying to get a ducted hose going from one module into another, and I'd be told, no, the astronauts will die. And if you look at Mir, they're all over the place. Flash forward, we have the ISS up there now, and it looks like a slow-motion collision of 2 wholly different approaches to not only spacecraft design, but safety and operations. And I know how it got there. It just got there through trial and error and practice and experience. Now you're bringing the private sector in. And the private sector, commercial aerospace, aviation, has a similar but different way of looking at risk. From the private sector, they sometimes look at it differently. How willing are you, or maybe is this what you're really trying to do here? Are you really trying to find a way that NASA can get out of some of these constraints and look at different ways? Because once you get to the moon and something breaks, you're going to have to be able to fix it there. And that's not, with a station you can do it to a certain extent, but this is almost a paradigm shift. Is this what you're sort of quietly looking for here, is how you really get to do this out there as opposed to think about it?
I think it's clear as we break the tie with the home planet, right, as we push further and further out, we're going to be at more and more distant destinations. And so we're going to have to be more self-sustaining, clearly, along the lines that you described. When we had the Columbia tragedy, we were stuck with station with our main life supply gone. So we were very much in a long duration, how do we keep crew on orbit standpoint. So we did a lot of things during that time frame that we thought were not possible. We were able to repair spacesuits, EMUs. We changed a pump out on an EMU, which anybody would have told us was impossible to do. We repaired a treadmill that was designed to never be repaired. We began those activities. We're going to even look at station. We're going to do some 3D printing here that we've planned to go look at some manufacturing. So we're going to have to do those things. And I think we can do that in parallel with the commercial sector, because the commercial sector knows how to do this in remote locations, how to operate in those locations. They can work with us hand in hand, and we can continue to move forward. So, I think we're realizing there's other ways of doing business. One other thing that we've learned really important on station is in the pharmaceutical world, we're now flying up some protein crystal growth modules that are essentially ones that fly on terrestrial labs today. And it turns out they would gin up the protein crystals in this 96 little well device. They would freeze it, then transport it on a truck to another research facility here on the ground terrestrially. And we said, collectively, along with nanoracks and with cases, we said, could we actually use that same technique and take it to space? So we actually froze a commercial 96 well device on the ground, flew it up to space station, and we've actually were able to observe crystal growth in space. So the pharmaceutical company now is looking at a device that they see in their labs every day. They don't have to build a unique space device. They can actually use that device in space in the same way they can in a terrestrial lab and get results back. So I think we're learning that some of the requirements, some of the things we put in place don't need to be there. We don't need to design everything to aerospace standards. Some things are perfectly fine in the more private sector standard, and that right mix between those two is something I think we can gain out of this public-private partnership that will help us moving forward.
We only have a couple more minutes, so let's take one more by phone, and then we'll see if we can get to the remaining ones here in the room.
Eli Siegel from Las Vegas Sun, you may ask your question.
Hi, thanks a lot. Real quickly, what are the foreign space agencies that you folks have been talking with? And then also, Bob, if you can give some more details on the guide, how heavy is it? Where in the Las Vegas Valley will it be tested? What would it look like? Have you already built it? How much money will it cost? Or how much money did it cost to build? Just to give more details on that, please.
We have spoken extensively with the Japanese Space Agency. We have also spoken with UAE, a couple other folks in the Mideast. We have to constantly assure them and reassure them that transportation, in spite of what they read and what they hear about the U.S. Congress, on appropriations and allocating enough money for NASA to work with, we have to constantly reassure them that transportation will be a reality in spite of those issues and those kinds of problems. So we would appreciate NASA having the monies that it needs to work with just as much as NASA would as well. As far as the guide is concerned, as I said, we will be testing that probably in one of the dry lakes, perhaps the one that we used for the Boeing drop tests out near Alamo. And we hope to be executing those tests on about January, February of 2014.
Let's take one here in the room, and then that'll be it for us today.
Dick Farley with Cape Cod today again. I'd like to go back to the process and policy question. At what point in the process and what kind of timeline, maybe Bill can answer this, are you giving consideration to international space industrial policy agreements is the one? Are you coordinating at all with state or DOD for issues like dispute resolution and defense considerations? And for Bob, perhaps, do you envision an international regime or a kind of space secretariat, or will you favor a more national space authority model for serving as a referee as this stuff progresses?
I recently went to the UN legal subcommittee in Vienna, and I gave them a discussion on what we're doing with the International Space Station. And the purpose of my visit to the UN legal subcommittee was to describe to them what we're actually doing with the intergovernmental agreements and what we have with the implementing arrangements we have with our foreign partners on board the space station. My intent was to show them that what we've been able to do with Space Station and throughout the life of Space Station, we've endured many redesign efforts, many long changes. We added the Russians in the middle of the program. And the basic frameworks and the basic construct that we were given through the Space Station activity, I believe serves as an excellent model as we look for more and more international cooperation in the exploration area, at least from a government standpoint. So my point to them was, before we go invent a whole new process or a whole new system, treaty level kind of things of dealing with exploration of humans throughout the solar system, I believe we ought to go back and look at what we've already accomplished with the Space Station model, the Space Station framework, and agreements, and see if those move forward. In terms of the international and private law aspects that you described, we've not had a lot of discussions there, and Bob may have something to add to that.
Yeah, our opinion is that we want to keep the process as simple as possible so that it doesn't fractionalize and just become immobile. So we want to follow the models that are already existing as far as the having the jurisdiction reside within the United States as the determining factor or the determinator of who and what is going to be the force behind the rules and regulations of operation. We don't want to expand those outside the jurisdiction of the United States. It would be completely unnecessary, and you would get into diminishing returns immediately. So our advocacy is for all the jurisdictional forces to be within the confines of the United States and using the United States court system for adjudication.
Okay, that's going to be it for us today. I want to thank the participants for joining us and thank everyone else as well for joining us today.
This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.